Jordan, welcome. Lovely to see you. I have a very direct question for you. It's about your thoughts on Piaget, which you've given lectures on. You've spoken of Jean Piaget in terms of being an absolute genius, and you've spoken about how his ultimate project was the unification of science and religion. And you've spoken about the essential role his thought gives in sort of linking biology and morality in some way. And you've also spoken about the logos as a big part of your work, but these two worlds I've never heard quite come together. So one of the things I want to ask you to begin with is how you see Piaget's central idea of assimilation and accommodation and the organism adapting to the environment and the equilibration of that, and how that connects to the sort of coherence of the logos. So it's really a chance to speak about Piaget in this context, particularly as whether it ends in childhood or whether it moves on to adulthood.
Well, I think the idea of assimilation and accommodation is actually a secularized version of the idea of the logos. I mean, ideas have history, right? Nothing comes out of nowhere, and profound ideas have a profound history. And the idea of the logos is something like, it's the description of the human psyche as an agent that's active in the confrontation with what it doesn't understand.
Yes.
And that in that active confrontation with what it doesn't understand, which is a kind of potential, right, a potential out of which new knowledge emerges, that it has to sacrifice its old structures and generate new ones. And so I would say that's imagistically represented or dramatically represented in the ancient idea of the dying and resurrecting God. So there's a Christian idea that's quite well articulated, that you should identify with the dying and resurrecting God. And part of what that means psychologically is that you should let go of your old dead structures and let something new come forward. So you might think, well, the mistake the ideologue makes is in identifying him or herself with what they already are. And then to try to make that total, right? That's the totalitarian impulse. Well, if you only identify with what you are, you have to abide by the totalitarian impulse. But if you're willing to let go of what you are in the service of what you could become, then you could identify with the part of you that transforms, which is somewhat painful, though it's not as painful as the alternative, as it turns out. And I think that Piaget, well, informed by all these ideas deeply, was able to articulate that in the concept of assimilation and accommodation. And he regarded that as the process that drove staged transitions, right? And he also associated that with Thomas Kuhn's idea of a paradigm shift. And so I'm not making unwarranted leaps here. He's laid out the groundwork for that substantially.
But he also stopped around formal operations, which is sort of arguably late adolescence, early adulthood. But that doesn't stop, right? That's the question.
Okay, well, here's an interesting thing. Carl Jung wrote a book called Mysterium Conjunctionis, which was the last book he wrote. And it's actually two books. The first half is a symbolic dictionary, essentially, and it's very difficult to read unless you've read pretty much everything else Jung wrote. But the second volume, I would regard it actually as an extension of Piaget's ideas of morality. So, and here's how Jung extends it, essentially. He thinks about, he describes it symbolically, first of all, and then articulates what the symbolism means. So he saw the last three stages of moral development as a sequence of male-female unions, speaking symbolically. Male standing for what's known, female standing for what's unknown. The first union was mind and emotion. Mind symbolically represented as male and emotion female. And so what that would mean would be that your rationality and your passions are integrated rather than at opposition with one another, which is kind of the classical Enlightenment idea, right? That passion is what leads reason astray. So it's more like a Nietzschean view that your passion and your intellect should be aligned. So then Jung would say, well, that forms the first conjunction, hence Mysterium Conjunctionis. To get your act together is to get your rational intellect and your emotional life all aligned in pursuit of the same goal. Of course, then the question is, what is the goal? But that's okay. Okay, so then the next conjunction, so now you say the united mind, the united rational emotional entity is now a single entity. Now it's male. Now the body is female. Okay, so you get the same symbolic representation, male-female union. So the next thing is to stop the performative contradictions, speaking philosophically, to take your united mind and emotions and to start to act out the same schema, so that your you're not contradicting yourself. You're not contradicting who you are abstractly with who you are concretely. Okay. And he thought of that as symbolized in Christianity by the incarnation. It's a lovely, brilliant idea to allow for full embodiment and action in the world. And that's the second conjunction. And so that's, you're acting out your convictions, and those convictions have rational, are both deeply set emotionally, but also are fully articulated rationally. So it makes you a force. Then there's a third conjunction. So now that becomes male. Right. And now the world becomes female. Right? And so his last conjunction was, you stop viewing yourself and the world as separate. Yeah. And so that's akin to the Buddhist idea. You know, Buddha was offered nirvana, right? That was a temptation in some sense. And Buddha's answer to that offer was, it's not appropriate for anyone to attain enlightenment. Enlightenment cannot be attained properly unless it's universal. Right. It's something like that. Bodhisattva ideal. Yeah. Right. So to pursue the ideal can't only involve you. Yeah. And so this is where I got the idea in part for the notion of cleaning up your room, because I learned this partly from Jung, but your room is actually not separate from your psyche. Because we're so materialistic, we think it is. But your room is also a drama. It's a dramatic forum. Sure. And it has a living nature because of that. And what that means, this is why behavioralism actually worked, even though it only concentrated, so to speak, on symptoms. Sure. You know, cleaning up your room involves cleaning up far more than your room. It might involve cleaning up your family, for example. Yeah. And so, okay, now, I'll just tie one more thing in there. Sure. The idea of the equilibrated state. Okay, so Piaget's basic observation was that if you put two systems in competition with one another to attain any end, the system that required compulsion to drive towards that end would be less efficient than the system that didn't. Right. So it's an initial hypothesis. And so his idea would be a movement forward based on negotiated settlement beats a movement forward based on tyranny. Right. in a head-to-head evolutionary competition. So. Right. Okay.
So I'm intrigued by all of this, but I'm also keen to understand the life cycle to some extent, because the risk of this sort of dialogue is that kind of observation about Piaget is wonderful until you reach, I don't know, early 20s, or a state of sort of evolution and development where you feel you're more or less mature, you're more or less an adult. But as you know, and many others know, that doesn't stop there.
Well, I think that's partly why Jung introduced these other three conceptualizations.
But are you saying that those conceptualizations keep going throughout the life cycle?
Oh, definitely.
Right.
You're not going to run out of things to fix up in the outside world.
Right.
Outside world.
Great, which is what I thought you were saying. So then you get to a point where you speak of self-authorship sometimes, about the importance of just knowing your own thoughts, having a sense of the social surround, but also forming your own relationship to that. And the work of people like Robert Keegan at Harvard and various other Piagetian and post-Piagetian scholars, they speak of that state as being a very evolved state and one we should all seek to attain, but not as the end story. And the reason I want to bring that up is that many of the public debates that you're embroiled in, they often seem to be kind of ideological in nature, that you're sort of fighting off the ideologues and you're saying there's perspective on this, there's history to this, there's value in this, and you're only seeing a part of it. And arguably that's a kind of developmental state that we go through. So two questions fall out of that. Two questions fall out of that. One is, what happens after self-authorship? How do we keep evolving? If Jung and Piaget are right about these, what happens next? Yeah. And the second question is, with regard to postmodernism and post-structuralism and neo-Marxism, the things that you have challenges with, can they be seen as a kind of state we go through, a sort of form of development that we have to transcend and include in some way?
Those are great questions. So the first one, we'll go to the equilibrated state issue, because an equilibrated state is one in which people will participate voluntarily. And so that's associated with the Piagetian emphasis on the game. Yeah. A good game is, I'll invite you to play, and if it's a good game, you'll play, and if it's a really good game, we can continue playing, and maybe the game will even improve as we play it. Okay, and there's genius in that, because what Piaget was noting, at least in part, is that the morality that emerges from iterated interactions is not the same morality that governs a single interaction. And so you can have an emergent morality that is actually the rule that governs a game that's playable across time. Yes. So then we say, well, I need to play a game that's playable across time because I have to play with me and me tomorrow and me next week and me next year. So I can't play too short-term a game because I kill my future self. Right. And then the game that I'm going to play to sustain my future self is actually going to turn out to be quite similar to the game that I would play with you, that would also iterate, and that with my family. And so the idea, you alluded to in some sense, the notion that there's something a bit too narrow about self-authoring for it to be the final destination of moral striving. But if the self-authoring is done properly, what it does is aim at an equilibrated state. So it has to be, I'm laying out and in our self-authoring program, we actually address this technically. So you have a goal. Okay, now we're going to get you to articulate its rationale so that you can defend it, right? Well, one of the ways we have you defend it is to say, okay, well, you're going to pursue this goal. How would it be good for you? How would it be good for the future you? How would it be good for your family? How would it be good for society? And the implication is that if the goal that you have chosen doesn't stack up all those players simultaneously, that it's a suboptimal goal. Not only for the other players, also them, but also for you, because you're actually not separate from the other players, because you extend across time. And an equilibrated state, this is the genius of the idea of the equilibrated state, is that it's a state that will sustain itself without external force.
Right. Got it. So if somebody's in one of those states, and that state just happens to be one of strong emphasis on inclusion, strong emphasis on dealing with past injustices, and strong emphasis on sort of, equalizing society in certain ways, they feel that that's what they're called upon to respond to. They feel as though that is their self-authorship, is to speak to that.
I don't believe it can be.
Okay, why not?
Because none of those are their ideas.
But what if they
They're
take them on?
ideological ideas.
Well, is it not possible for someone to take upon themselves a critical relationship to that so that it becomes their own?
Yes.
Right.
It's definitely possible to do that, but it very rarely happens.
But it can happen, and that can be a good thing.
It's always a good thing when you take a set of abstract moral principles and unite them with your own experience. I mean, there's a deep Christian idea that you're supposed to imitate Christ, right? That's the deepest of Christian ideas. Jung wrote a lot about that. It's like, that doesn't mean you travel to the Middle East and dress in white robes and carry a cross. Like, that happened 2,000 years ago. What it means is that you bring the doctrine to life in your own life, right? Really in the specific particularities of your own life. And so the first thing I would say is that if you try to do that with an ideology, it immediately ceases to be an ideology, because you actually can't do that. Your life will burst the bounds of the ideology. But I would say that to the degree that you start to make the ideology truly personal, that you also start to transform it in ways that are beneficial. The problem with ideology is it's a universal set of solutions. And you think, well, that's great. It's like, well, yeah, except it eradicates the particularities, and that's not great at all.
So, ideology is tyrannical when we're sort of unconsciously subject to it, and it's shaping our actions and our lives. But there's also a kind of ideology that's our own critical relationship to a set of ideas and how we embody them and experience them in our lives.
I wouldn't necessarily one of the things that I've strived to do is to distinguish between a genuine religious system and an ideology. An ideology is a parasite on a religious system. So a religious system has to have a variety of elements, and I detail them out a lot in Maps of Meaning. I won't go through them. But it's the thing about a religious view of the world is that the positives and negatives are both included. So the individual is a hero, but also an adversary. Culture is a tyrant, but also a wise king. Nature is a beautiful, wondrous, revolutionary, transformative force, and also cancer and Anopheles mosquitoes and the plague. And ideologies don't play that game. They pick and choose their narrative characters.
No, I understand, but surely it's possible then along those same lines for someone to say, look, white privileged men are fine and often wonderful people doing great work, but they have too much power, and there are other people who don't have access to those worlds and those opportunities because of that
entrenched bias. As soon as they
bias.
use the terminology white privilege, I'm out of the discussion.
Right, well, is that not going too far? That sounds ideological to me. That sounds like something that you're subject to, that you can't see beyond or relate to.
No, I don't think so. I think it's part of the nexus of...
You're captive to that critique in such a way that you can't see any possible good in it.
No, I understand the motivations that are driving the use of that terminology, I think, better than the person who's using the terms.
But in your experience, in a particular context,
yeah.
But this issue is happening around the world in multiple contexts, where people who feel marginalized, who feel they have, feel they've lost out in certain ways, who might try and tidy the room, might try and sort themselves out, but still find they can't get a job, can't get enough money, can't get access to a life they want.
I'm not clear at all that that's the case in the West. No, I don't believe that. I mean, we know perfectly well, for example, that the best predictors of success in the West are intelligence and conscientiousness.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll come back to this in a moment in the public event, but thanks very much for talking to us.
You bet. You bet.